What would it be like to have so much money that you hired an actual human being just to stand in your bedroom and warm the sheets before you got in? How would it feel to serve your guests a shimmering, jewel-toned jelly that glowed under candlelight, simply because you could? And what kind of person decides the perfect dinner party includes eating gold leaf for dessert, while a turtle in a diamond collar wanders between the chairs? Would you last an afternoon wearing a steel corset so tight you couldn't breathe properly? Could you smile politely while your neighbors casually bid against you for your own dog at a charity auction? And how would you handle a dinner where every guest arrived with their own personal footman, whose sole purpose was to stand behind the chair, looking decorative and mildly miserable? Tonight, we're stepping into the 1890s, a world of unhinged luxury, peacocking, and a dizzying number of completely useless gold-plated objects. Forget social media bragging rights. Victorian elites made modern influencers look like they were on a budget. We're talking rented pineapples, pet ostriches at breakfast, arsenic wallpaper in the parlor, and garden hermits paid to never speak to you. So, before you slip into your comfiest pajamas and wonder whether your scented candle qualifies as a status symbol, take a second to like this video, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me the most ridiculous thing you've ever bought to impress someone else. Then dim the lights, settle in, and let's take a slow, incredulous walk through the most bizarre ways Victorians showed off their wealth. In the late Victorian era, if you wanted to make a statement, you didn't buy a designer handbag or park an imported car outside your house. You acquired, or more likely rented, a pineapple. Yes, a fruit. The tropical crown jewel that no one in your damp English neighborhood could grow, and that most people had only ever seen in pictures. Pineapples were rare, they were ruinously expensive, and they were mostly decorative. A single one could cost the equivalent of hundreds of dollars today, so they were far too valuable to simply eat. Eating it would be like driving a brand new luxury car straight into a ditch just to see how it handles. Instead, the correct Victorian approach was to place it in the center of your table for guests to admire, and, this is the important part, to know you could afford it. If you didn't actually own a pineapple, you could rent one. Yes, entire businesses existed for the sole purpose of loaning out pineapples for a day or two, like a high-end prop department for the insecure rich. Your footman, because of course you had one, would be dispatched to collect the fruit from its previous admirer, ideally before it began to soften. You'd set it out during your gathering, ensuring it was visible from multiple angles, maybe even giving it a little spotlight effect from the gas lamps. And after the evening's polite nods and compliments, it would be returned for the next hostess to pretend she had imported it fresh from the Caribbean. Those without the budget for the real thing could buy fakes, wax or carved wooden pineapples so convincing at a distance you could almost believe they had a tropical scent. Almost. The symbolism was clear. A pineapple wasn't just a fruit, it was proof of connections, money, and the ability to waste both. If you're wondering whether anyone actually ate them, sometimes, usually when they were finally too far gone for display, someone would cut away the salvageable bits and serve them in small, jewel-like pieces. By that point, the flavor was probably closer to fermented regret than fresh island paradise. But the guests would smile and pretend otherwise, because, in the Victorian social game, appearances were the whole point, and the pineapple was the edible equivalent of walking into a party wearing a dress made entirely of banknotes. If you were a member of the Victorian elite, the question wasn't whether you had footmen, it was how many you could afford to have standing around doing absolutely nothing. These were not simply employees, they were human ornaments, chosen as carefully as a vase or a chandelier, with the added requirement that they could refill your sherry glass without looking directly at you. Height was everything. Footmen were ideally tall enough to be visually impressive, but not so tall that they intimidated the host. They were often matched in height to within an inch of one another, because heaven forbid your dinner party lineup looked asymmetrical. Uniforms were ornate, pressed to perfection, and often cost more than the servant's yearly wage. The ideal expression, somewhere between mild boredom and the look of someone mentally composing a resignation letter they'd never dare submit. And they weren't just stationed in hallways. A truly wealthy home had a footman or two standing behind each guest at the dinner table, arms folded, waiting for the moment to pass a plate, pour wine, or discreetly remove a dish that had offended someone's delicate sensibilities. In extreme cases, the rich turned this into a sport. There are accounts of wealthy hosts using footmen as live chess pieces in elaborate garden parties. The men would move across giant boards at their employer's command, swapping positions for hours, the perfect blend of spectacle. Look how many people I can pay to waste their day. For the guests, it was part of the entertainment. For the footmen, it was an endurance test in remaining perfectly still while standing on cold mud, wondering if their entire job could be replaced by a particularly dignified hat stand. And in a way, that was the point. The very fact that human beings were being paid to exist as silent, symmetrical furniture was itself the flex. The message was clear. I have enough money to pay people to look quietly miserable in my home. If humans as furniture wasn't enough to show off, the next step was filling your house with animals that had no business living. The Victorian upper class treated pet ownership like an Olympic event, competing to see who could keep the most exotic, impractical, and outright dangerous creatures. Ostriches roaming the lawn, naturally. Monkeys perched on the breakfast table, stealing biscuits from startled guests, essential. And for those with truly stratospheric wealth, a giraffe. Yes, in Victorian England. Owning one was the pinnacle of animal bragging rights, the equivalent of rolling up to brunch in a gold-plated private jet today. The logistics were, of course, a nightmare. Heating costs soared to keep tropical animals alive through damp English winters. Meals had to be specially sourced, because even the most indulgent kitchen wasn't stocked with whatever it is a giraffe eats in January. Servants were often drafted into double duty as zookeepers, tasked with cleaning up after animals that had no intention of behaving in polite society. For guests, it was a spectacle, part dinner party, part accidental wildlife documentary. The shock value alone was worth the trouble. Imagine sipping your tea while an ostrich leans over your shoulder to inspect the sugar bowl. For the host, every wide-eyed reaction was proof that they had pulled ahead in the never-ending race of social one-upmanship. The point wasn't whether you actually liked animals, it was whether you could afford them, and more importantly, afford to replace them, when the climate, diet, or sheer absurdity of the arrangement inevitably claimed them. Because in the Victorian world of status, even your menagerie was a temporary accessory in the performance of wealth. If an exotic pet died, and in the Victorian climate, they often did, you didn't just bury it in the garden. That would be wasteful. No, the logical next step was to have it stuffed, dressed, and posed as if it were still enjoying your company. Victorian taxidermy wasn't just a craft, it was an art form and a competitive one at that. A well-heeled household could hire a specialist to preserve animals in elaborate scenarios. Squirrels in waistcoats sipping tea, kittens posed as a full-string quartet, or the occasional fox mid-curtsy in a tiny ball gown. In some cases, the animals weren't even ones the owner had ever met in life. Rare finds like platypuses, shrews, or the mythical jackalope could be purchased from dealers, posed to your exact specifications, and displayed for the shock value alone. The intent was part scientific curiosity, part grotesque theatre. Guests would wander through parlors and hallways, stopping to marvel, or quietly recoil, at a badger in a smoking jacket or a family of mice holding a picnic on a velvet blanket. For children, it could be whimsical or nightmarish, depending on how much the glass eyes followed you across the room. For servants, it meant dusting tiny taxidermy banjos without snapping a paw off. The deeper message was clear. The Victorian elite saw nature itself as another possession, something to arrange, dress, and display at their whim. Death was no obstacle. In fact, it was an opportunity to make the animal even more of a conversation piece. Because nothing says, I have both money and control, quite like immortalizing your deceased hedgehog in a tiny chair with a newspaper. Only in Victorian society could grief be transformed into a fully catered, highly competitive social gathering. Mourning wasn't just a private affair. It was a public performance, complete with invitations, menus, and a silent tally of who did it best. Black-edged stationery announced the event, with handwriting so ornate you could barely make out the deceased's name. Guests arrived in strict black attire, not just any black, but fabrics that reflected the appropriate depth of sorrow. Jewelry was allowed only if it contained a lock of the deceased's hair. Even the family dog might wear a somber black ribbon around its neck, lest anyone suspect you were moving on too quickly. Inside, every mirror was covered, every portrait draped. Black crepe hung from chandeliers and picture frames, creating the overall effect of a haunted wedding. The menu leaned into the theme: grief cake, sorrowful stew, and an unsettling blackcurrant jelly that trembled under the candlelight, like it knew something you didn't. Entertainment ranged from melancholy poetry reading to full-blown competitive sobbing. Ladies dabbed at their eyes with monogrammed handkerchiefs, while discreetly checking who was watching. There were even instances of inviting the dead to dinner by propping up post-mortem portraits in prominent places or setting an empty chair at the table. The louder the mourning, the more social capital it earned. Underneath the black silk and tear-streaked cheeks, mourning parties were about status. They proved you could afford not only to grieve in style, but to feed and entertain others while doing it. It was empathy turned into spectacle, a reminder that even in death, appearances came first. Victorians didn't just enjoy gold, they weaponized it. If an object could be covered in a thin layer of the stuff, it probably was. This wasn't about utility, it was about sending a silent but unmistakable message. I have enough money to make even my mousetraps a luxury item. Soap dishes, hairbrushes, toilet chains, all fair game for gilding. A particularly committed hostess might even have her chamber pots adorned in gold leaf, a bizarre flex that said, "Yes, even my most private moments are worth a fortune." And it didn't stop at bathroom fixtures. There are documented cases of gold-plated bedpans, ornate gold dog collars, and dinner service sets so blindingly shiny that guests needed to angle themselves away from direct reflection. Of course, the problem with gold is that it tarnishes less than silver, but still needs polishing, which meant employing yet more servants to keep it gleaming. The irony was delicious. The very people these ostentatious objects were meant to impress were often the same ones polishing them behind the scenes. It wasn't about comfort, or even about function. It was about the optics of excess, a visual language of power where a gilded mousetrap wasn't ridiculous. It was a quiet declaration that you'd never had to touch one yourself. The more impractical the gilded item, the more potent the social message. Because in Victorian high society, pointless was the point. If you think interior design trends today can be questionable, imagine willingly covering your walls in poison because it looked pretty. In the mid to late 19th century, emerald green wallpaper, made with actual arsenic, became the height of fashion. The color was rich, vibrant, and almost unnervingly intense under candlelight. It was also, quite literally, lethal. The danger was no secret. People knew arsenic was poisonous, but in the Victorian hierarchy of concerns, a perfect shade of green easily outranked not dying. Dinner guests might leave with headaches, nausea, or mysterious rashes, but they'd all agree your drawing room looked stunning. For some, the risk was part of the allure, a way of showing you could afford to flirt with danger while swathed in silk. Arsenic wallpaper wasn't confined to drawing rooms either. Bedrooms, nurseries, even servants' quarters were lined with it. Sometimes, the very people polishing your gold-plated mousetraps were doing so in slow, toxic agony. Hosts would throw arsenic parties where guests speculated about whose symptoms were real and whose were just for dramatic effect. Servants were sometimes tasked with discreetly replacing sections of peeling wallpaper before flakes could land in the soup. Lawsuits and public health campaigns eventually curbed the trend, but not before it became an enduring example of Victorian priorities. Better to die in a gorgeous room than live with beige walls. When you've already gilded your soap dish and poisoned your guests with wallpaper, the question becomes, how do you take eccentricity to the next level? For some Victorians, the answer was to hire a hermit to live in their garden. This wasn't a metaphorical role. Wealthy landowners actually employed men, always men, to dwell in specially built hermit huts on their estates. The contract terms were bizarre. No bathing, no haircuts, no speaking to visitors unless approached, and absolutely no leaving the property. The goal was to cultivate an air of mystical wisdom, as if the hermit had retreated from the corruption of the world. Never mind that he was on payroll and lived within shouting distance of the main house. Guests would be encouraged to discover the hermit during a walk in the garden, marveling at his ragged robes, tangled beard, and soulful silence. Some estates even provided reading material, so the hermit could be caught mid-philosophical reflection. The job was poorly paid, deeply uncomfortable, and carried the constant risk of being fired if you looked too clean, too healthy, or too cheerful. It was performance art before the term existed, except the artist wasn't there by choice, and the audience was congratulating itself for owning such an oddity. For the employer, it wasn't about wisdom at all. It was about control, spectacle, and having the ultimate conversational flex. Oh, you haven't got a hermit in your garden? How quaint. The Victorian elite had an uncanny ability to turn even hardship into a form of entertainment, and nowhere was that more apparent than in the phenomenon of the poverty party. Guests were invited to dress in rags, eat gruel, and generally experience destitution, all without any of the actual danger or discomfort of being poor. Invitations were printed on shabby parchment, often with edges artfully torn or burnt for effect. Guests would arrive in deliberately patched clothing, sometimes made from torn silk or cashmere, with diamond brooches winking just beneath the frayed neckline. The menu was sparse: thin gruel, stale bread, and charity cheese that tasted exactly as inspiring as it sounds. The entertainment could include folk songs, charity raffles, or games like Pin the Patch on the Pauper. The point wasn't to mock, at least not openly, but to perform empathy in a safe, controlled environment. Hosts could later boast about their generosity, having raised funds for the less fortunate, while still ensuring their own experience of poverty came with well-lit ballrooms and carriages waiting outside. For the guests, it was an amusing novelty, like trying on someone else's life for an hour. For the actual poor, it was just another reminder that even suffering could be turned into a trend, as long as it could be removed at the end of the evening, like a rented pineapple or a diamond-studded turtle collar. In the Victorian era, indoor plumbing wasn't just a convenience, it was an event. Having a bathroom inside your home was a luxury so rare that it became a showpiece, and no expense was spared in making it absurdly, impractically magnificent. Picture a room tiled in imported Italian ceramics, with gilded door handles, crystal gaslight sconces, and porcelain basins so ornate they looked more like fine china than something you'd dare put your hands in. Toilets were proudly tall, with high-mounted wooden cisterns and pull chains plated in gold, because nothing says refined like urinating beneath a brass swan spout. Accessories were equally over the top: silver-plated hairbrush, monogrammed towels embroidered so thickly they were more decorative than functional, and perfume bottles shaped like swans or dolphins. Some households even commissioned carved marble toilets around, ensuring guests would leave talking about the lavatory rather than the dining room. Of course, the more complex the plumbing, the more likely it was to malfunction, leading to loud, rattling flushes, unexpected leaks, and the occasional flooded parlor. But inconvenience was a small price to pay for the chance to casually mention, "Oh, do come see the bathroom. It's quite something." If you've ever been stuck at a wedding reception where the speeches just won't end, imagine that, but with 10 more courses, no DJ, and a host who is keeping track of how much you eat like it's a competitive sport. For the Victorian elite, a dinner party wasn't just an evening event, it was a marathon, an endurance test, and a subtle form of social warfare. Meals could stretch on for hours, sometimes days, especially during high society events. The menu read less like a plan for nourishment and more like a dare: oysters, turtle soup, roast beef, whole turkeys, entire swans, game pies, puddings, moulded jellies, and delicate pastries stacked like precarious architectural experiments. And that was just dinner number one. By midnight, supper would be served. In some of the grandest houses, meals were staged like theatre productions. Servants moved in synchronized patterns, each carrying silver trays heavy enough to double as medieval shields. Guests were expected to keep pace with the courses. Too slow and you'd be caught chewing when the next plate arrived. Too fast and you'd look greedy. To leave early was a breach of etiquette, which meant even the most discreet guest had to endure the 3 a.m. coffee course, pretending to still be thrilled at the sight of gold leaf-covered petit fours. Meanwhile, the host basked in the knowledge that they'd kept you captive, well-fed to the point of discomfort, and perfectly aware of your dependence on their generosity. It was excess disguised as hospitality, like a modern influencer inviting you over for light snack, only to force-feed you a 12-course tasting menu while live-streaming your increasingly dazed expression. If you think today's celebrity red carpet outfits covered in Swarovski crystals are over the top, the Victorians would have laughed, and then covered the carpet itself in gemstones just to one-up you. The ruling principle was simple: if you can cover it in jewels, you should. And if it becomes completely useless in the process, even better. Walking sticks were topped with emeralds, opera glasses encrusted with diamonds, and personal grooming tools, hairbrushes, shoehorns, even nail buffers, glittered with tiny rubies. A lady's hand fan might be painted in gold leaf and tipped with pearls, rendering it so heavy that actual fanning was impossible without risking shoulder injury. The pièce de résistance was often the pet's accessories. Dogs wore collars set with amethysts, parrots perched on silver swings studded with sapphires, and one heiress was rumoured to have commissioned a diamond-studded tortoise shell, ensuring her reptile was both slow-moving and highly muggable. Jewelers loved the trend, because there was no practical limit to how ridiculous it could get. The only rule was that the object had to be visible to others. Your bejeweled letter opener wasn't about opening mail. It was about leaving it strategically out on your desk so a guest could say, "My goodness, is that a sapphire?" And you could casually reply, "Oh, that old thing, just something I picked up in Paris." It was the 19th century equivalent of buying a luxury sports car you never drive, all polish, no purpose. If the dinner party was where Victorians showed off their endurance, the opera box was where they showed off their strategic social engineering. These weren't just seats, they were stages within a stage, and the performance wasn't on the floor below, it was in the tiers above. Prime boxes at London's Covent Garden or the Paris Opera were often passed down through families, and getting one in a desirable location was like winning a Victorian lottery. The right box let you be seen by everyone without having to strain your neck. Guests leaned forward at just the right angle so the light caught their diamonds, or they reclined just enough to display a perfectly arched foot in satin slippers. Some families redecorated their boxes like private parlors, with custom upholstery, gilded mirrors, and even private attendants who served champagne between acts. Theatrics weren't just for the stage. A well-timed laugh or a dramatic sigh during the performance could draw attention to your presence as effectively as a jeweled tiara. And yes, there was a pecking order. If your box was too far to the side, you were considered socially peripheral, too high up, and you might as well be in the cheap seats with the merchants. It was the Victorian version of a verified checkmark, a visible badge of belonging to the in crowd, and a public declaration that you had both the money and the connections to be exactly where you were. Today, it's a little like dropping 5 figures for a courtside seat at Wimbledon, but showing up in a gown worth more than the prize money. Victorians loved a good conservatory, a glasshouse for growing exotic plants year-round. But in the hands of the ultra-rich, it became a greenhouse meets status symbol that was both sweltering and absurd. Imagine strolling into a tropical jungle in the middle of a snowy London winter, only to realize every plant inside has its own servant. Heating these vast glass palaces was enormously expensive, requiring coal-fired boilers that roared day and night. The goal wasn't to cultivate anything particularly edible. No one cared about growing tomatoes. The goal was to grow orchids from the Amazon, ferns from Australia, and palms from the East Indies. All so guests could gasp at their impractical beauty while shedding layers of velvet to avoid fainting in the humidity. In the social code of the time, a lush conservatory signaled global reach. Your wealth could literally bend nature to your will. It was the Victorian equivalent of having a private indoor beach in a penthouse. Impressive, a little surreal, and wildly unnecessary. For most Victorians, train travel was a necessary evil. Crowded carriages, soot in your hair, and the lingering smell of boiled ham from someone else's lunch. For the upper crust, however, trains became an extension of the drawing room, because why limit your luxury to your stationary mansion when you could take it on the rails? A custom-built private railway carriage wasn't just transportation, it was a moving stage for social performance. Imagine polished mahogany paneling reflecting the glow of crystal chandeliers, silk curtains tied with gold braid swaying gently with the rhythm of the tracks, and a dining table set with the kind of porcelain that would give a modern-day flight attendant an anxiety attack. Menus in these rolling dining rooms read like something from a Parisian hotel: oyster bisque, pheasant with Madeira sauce, and puddings topped with hand-whipped cream, all prepared in a sweltering onboard kitchen the size of a pantry. Servants performed balancing acts worthy of the circus, carrying tureens of soup without spilling a drop despite the train's tendency to lurch unexpectedly. Guests affected an air of total nonchalance, even as the silver sugar tongs slid off the table mid-dessert. The point was not convenience. If anything, it was less practical than eating at home, but the prestige. Arriving at the station in a carriage that doubled as a palace sent a message to onlookers. Not only could you afford to travel in style, you could turn a commute into a catered event. Today's equivalent might be flying a private jet with a full wine cellar. Unnecessary, borderline ridiculous, but exactly the kind of thing people will gossip about for years. Before the invention of refrigeration, ice was a logistical miracle. It had to be harvested in massive blocks from frozen lakes, sometimes in New England, sometimes in Norway, and shipped hundreds or thousands of miles in insulated holds packed with sawdust. Most households would never see ice outside of a medical emergency. But if you were rich enough in the Victorian era, you didn't just have ice in summer, you had too much ice in summer. Entire underground ice houses were constructed on estates, some capable of storing 20 or 30 tons of it for months. You could serve chilled champagne in July, molded ices in the shape of swans, and fruit sorbets that made guests gasp in delight, and possibly in toothache. Ice became a way to show off not just wealth, but reach. Ice sculptures, swans, castles, Grecian goddesses, were carved for dinner parties, melting slowly under candlelight as if to say, "We can afford to watch beauty dissolve in front of us." Guests would sip mint juleps clinking with cubes that had travelled farther than most of the people. The obsession bordered on the absurd. Some hosts had ice shipped in, just for a single soiree, paying the equivalent of a servant's yearly wages for the privilege. It was the 19th century equivalent of filling your hot tub with champagne. Impractical, decadent, and entirely the point. Victorian clothing wasn't just about fashion, it was a full-contact sport, a display of competitive discomfort where the pain was the point. If you were wealthy, your wardrobe was a daily press release announcing exactly how much money and staff it took to keep you looking that good. Let's start with the hats. These weren't modest little bonnets. These were architectural marvels stacked with ostrich feathers, silk flowers, taxidermied birds, and, in one notorious case, an actual mechanical hummingbird that flapped its wings at parties. Wearing one often meant ducking through doorways at a 45-degree angle, but removing it too early in the evening was social suicide. Corsets were a daily battle between vanity and lung capacity. A wasp waist of 18 inches was considered ideal, meaning your maid might spend the better part of an hour lacing you in so tightly you could feel your breakfast rearranging itself. Passing out was a known occupational hazard. Fainting couches existed for a reason, and not just for dramatic effect. Fabrics were another status signal. Imported silks from China, French lace so fine it could pass through a wedding ring, velvets dyed in colours so rich they almost seemed to hum under the gaslight. These were the tools of sartorial intimidation. The wealthy wore gowns so heavy with beading that simply walking from one end of the parlour to the other could feel like dragging a reluctant dog on a leash. And then there were the gloves. Always gloves. Kid leather gloves so tight they had to be eased on with a button hook. White gloves for the opera, mourning gloves edged in black. Gloves weren't just accessories, they were evidence that you did not, under any circumstances, do manual labour. It's no wonder some women had dedicated glove maids to keep their collections sorted and ready, because nothing killed the vibe like arriving at a ball wearing last season's stitching. If you think today's red carpet couture looks impractical, remember, at least those gowns don't require a small army of women to get you in and out of them. If the Victorian mansion was a body, servants were its nervous system, unseen, constantly in motion, and expected to keep everything running without ever making themselves the focus. And if you were truly wealthy, you didn't just have a servant, or even a handful of them. You had an army, dozens of humans whose collective purpose was to ensure you never lifted anything heavier than a dessert fork. The sheer number mattered. Having 8 servants for a townhouse was respectable. Having 30 was a statement. Having over 100 was a flex so large it could be seen from the neighbouring county. It wasn't just about the work they did, it was about being able to say you had people to do it, even if the task itself was absurd. At the top stood the butler, the visible face of the household's dignity. He was the man guests met first, whose tone of good evening could communicate either genuine welcome or the subtle reminder that you weren't quite important enough to be there. The butler controlled the wine cellar, the silverware, and access to the family, and, crucially, the pantry key. Below him in rank, but equally formidable, was the housekeeper, the commander of the indoor army. She oversaw every maid, every tablecloth, every scrap of laundry, and her word was law in her domain. Beneath them came the specialist ranks, ladies' maids and valets who handled dressing their employers like living mannequins. Cooks who produced meals of such abundance that half would be scraped into the servants' slop buckets by nightfall, and footmen, chosen for their height and legs like matching bookends, who existed primarily to stand still and look decorative while wearing powdered wigs. Then came the general labour tier, kitchen maids, laundry maids, scullery maids, hall boys, and boot boys. Their tasks were endless and often miserable, scrubbing chamber pots, blacking stoves, hauling water, and they were invisible by design. In some households, the lowest-ranking servants were not allowed to speak directly to the family unless spoken to, and some weren't even permitted to use the main staircase. It was a workplace where your position in the pecking order dictated where you could walk. Servants' quarters were deliberately separated from the main family spaces, often in attics, basements, or purpose-built wings known as the back premises. This wasn't just to keep noise and clutter out of sight. It was a social statement. The family might have rooms with marble fireplaces and silk curtains, while the servants slept in narrow iron beds with thin blankets, often in rooms so small you could open a window or the door, but not both at the same time. Proximity to work mattered more than comfort. The butler might have a slightly larger room near the wine cellar to keep watch over the family's liquid assets, while the cook often had quarters near the kitchen so she could rise before dawn to start the ovens. Lower-ranking servants sometimes shared beds to save space, a fact that would horrify modern HR departments, but was considered efficient housekeeping in 1890. The Victorian servants' day started before the family woke up, sometimes as early as 5 a.m. for the lowest ranks, and often ended after the family went to bed, which could be past midnight after a dinner party. That's 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. Half day off was a concept for the lucky few, usually restricted to lower housemaids and errand boys, and even then, it was often spent running personal errands for the cook or housekeeper. And don't think a dinner party meant extra pay. For the servants, it meant longer hours, faster work, and being on the receiving end of any scolding if the lobster soufflé sank or the wine wasn't decanted early enough. For most servants, wages were meager, enough to live on, but not enough to save much. A housemaid might earn 10 15s a year, roughly £1 a month, a kitchen maid slightly less, and a butler perhaps 50 80 which still put him well below even the lower middle-class clerks in pay. The real perks were the room and board, not because they were luxurious, but because they removed the need to find your own housing or buy your own food. Tips and perquisites were a big deal. Leftover wine, cast-off clothing, or small cash gifts from guests. These perks were part of the unspoken economy of service. A lady's maid might inherit her mistress's old gowns, altered for her own use or sold discreetly, while the cook might claim the ham bone after it had done its duty in the soup. Days off were rare, and in some houses, non-existent, except for Christmas afternoon or after church on Sundays. When servants did get time off, they were expected to be discreet. No drunken singing in the servants' hall before returning to duty. The truly daring might use a half day to visit family or sweetheart, but it was always with the awareness that a single missed curfew could mean dismissal. Marriage was often the end of a servant's career, especially for women, who were expected to leave service once they went. Men sometimes brought wives into service roles on the same estate, but only if the employer approved. It wasn't unheard of for a footman to be demoted or dismissed simply for being too distracted after a courtship. If this sounds like running a luxury hotel without the tips, you're not far off. Except that the guests never left. The staff were permanent, and the front of house was an elaborate performance for the family's social equal. Servants were part of the spectacle, much like an art collection or a fleet of carriages. A house without servants wasn't just inconvenient, it was a blow to social standing. The Victorian wealthy didn't simply live in comfort, they lived inside a carefully maintained illusion that comfort happened by magic, a magic conjured by an army of underpaid, overworked humans moving silently through the hidden corridors of the house. For most people, dinnerware is a practical concern. You need plates that hold food, forks that pierce it, and glasses that don't leak. For wealthy Victorians, dinnerware was an arms race, not for utility, but for utterly unnecessary opulence. It wasn't enough to have fine china, it had to be the right fine china, imported from the correct porcelain houses in Limoges or Dresden, decorated with hand-painted scenes so delicate you'd be terrified to eat off them. Some sets had plates so heavily gilded with gold leaf that you couldn't even cut into your roast without scraping the decoration, which, incidentally, was considered terribly gauche. Dinner service became theatre. Entire multi-course meals were designed not for the flavour, but to match the plates they were served on. Soup might be ladled into bowls shaped like lilies, fish presented on porcelain platters painted with swimming carp, and desserts arranged on stands that looked like miniature marble temples. If you could design a menu that made your guests gasp at the tableware before they even tasted the food, you'd won. Of course, the true champions of dinnerware one-upmanship didn't stop at matching plates and food. Some had porcelain made to match the wallpaper in the dining room, so that even the gravy boat blended into the aesthetic. Others commissioned plates with portraits of the guests themselves, a surprise only revealed when the soup was finished and faces emerged from the porcelain, staring back up at their owners. And then there was the matter of quantity. A basic set for a well-off family might be 60 or 70 pieces. The truly wealthy ordered sets with hundreds of items, including gravy boats in triplicate and forks with specific shapes for foods most people had never heard of. If you could summon a footman to fetch the asparagus tongs without anyone batting an eye, you were in the upper league. Today's equivalent might be the influencer who buys a $900 coffee table just to leave it unopened on the counter, a pure flex that exists to be seen, not used. The difference is, Victorian guests expected you to parade your wastefulness and would judge you harshly if you failed to keep pace in the dinnerware wars. So here we are, in a world where pineapples are more valuable than friendships, where men are paid to stand motionless in livery, and where your soup might match the curtains. The Victorian wealthy didn't just have money, they weaponized it, turning every object, every outfit, every dinner plate into a social announcement. It's easy to laugh now, but strip away the gaslight chandeliers and arsenic wallpaper, and the instinct isn't so foreign. Today, maybe it's designer sneakers instead of gilded bedpan, or a fridge full of artisan kombucha instead of a cellar full of imported ice. Different props, same performance. If you're still awake, you've traveled through the corridors and gardens and absurd drawing rooms of 19th century luxury without once needing a footman to hold your chair. And if you're not, well, maybe you're dreaming of your own diamond-collared turtle by now. If you enjoyed this slow waltz through the strangest side of the Victorian elite, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's the modern-day equivalent of leaving a calling card. And I'd love to know, what's the most ridiculous thing you've ever bought, not because you needed it, but because it made a story? For now, rest easy. Forget about gilded mousetraps, asparagus tongs, and swans carved from ice. This is your quiet place. Good night. Script written by Clara Finch, because some stories still deserve a soul.